Toddler saw a German shepherd tangled in fishing nets by the lake. The ending melted every heart. You think you've seen kindness? Think again. What happened between a child and a wounded animal in the middle of nowhere has turned into one of the most heartwarming stories of the year. It's raw. It's real. And it will restore your faith in humanity. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. The evening had settled gently over the small American lakeside town, painting the water in strokes of amber and violet. The crickets had just begun their nightly song, and the smell of damp earth carried across the breeze. On the porch of an old wooden farmhouse, a toddler in a soft blue dress knelt with all the seriousness of childhood, pushing her tiny toy boat across the rain puddles that had collected by the steps. Her golden hair curled against her cheeks, her laughter faint but precious, a rare sound since her mother's passing. Her grandfather rocked slowly in his chair, pipe resting on the arm, humming a tune half lost to time. To him, the lake was only background, a still mirror that had watched generations come and go. But to the little girl, every ripple, every whisper of the breeze carried a story. That evening, as thunder muttered far away in the hills, she stopped mid-play, her head tilting like a bird listening for something more. A faint sound drifted on the wind. At first, it was so soft it seemed part of the lake itself, a muffled cry hidden in the waves. The girl frowned. It wasn't the croak of frogs nor the chatter of ducks. It was thinner, weaker, laced with desperation. She tugged at her grandfather's sleeve, pointing toward the water, but he only smiled tiredly. "Just the lake talking, sweet pea," he whispered, settling back in his chair. But her small heart wasn't convinced. She stood, her toy boat forgotten, and began to walk barefoot down the worn dirt path that led to the shore. Her little shoes dangled from her hand, dress brushing the grass as she hurried, eyes wide with urgency. The closer she came, the clearer the sound grew, not the rhythm of the lake, but sharp whimpers, trembling cries swallowed by the evening wind. And then she saw it. At the far edge of the lake, half hidden beneath rotting reeds and discarded nets, a large German shepherd thrashed in the water. His powerful body was bound by cruel tangles of nylon, each movement dragging him deeper into exhaustion. The lake, which had always been gentle, now seemed to conspire against him, pulling, tightening, stealing away his breath. The girl froze at the sight, her little chest rising and falling fast. No adult stood near. No voice explained the danger. Yet, instinct stronger than fear pulled her forward. She splashed into the shallows, tiny hands reaching for the nets as if her very touch could undo them. The shepherd's eyes caught hers, wild, desperate, yet softening when he saw her. For a moment, the frantic thrashing paused, as though he recognized something in the innocence of that child. The girl pressed her palm against the soaked ropes, her fingers trembling. Tears spilled down her cheeks, silent and pure, falling into the same water that threatened to take him. It was a moment no passerby could ignore. A child who had lost so much, and a dog who might lose everything, connected by compassion that required no words. The whimpers of the shepherd mingled with the child's tiny sobs, carrying across the lake like a forgotten hymn. The cry by the lake had been heard, and though the town did not yet know it, that small act of a toddler's heart would awaken an entire community, changing lives far beyond the quiet ripples of that evening. The lake had always been the town's pride. Once, it shimmered like glass in the summers, children laughing as they skipped stones across its surface, fishermen calling out greetings from wooden boats, families spreading picnic blankets beneath the maples that framed the shore. In the fall, it mirrored fiery leaves, and in winter, its frozen skin carried the laughter of ice skaters. But those days belonged to another time. Now, the lake was quiet, its surface often still and lonely, broken only by the occasional ripple of ducks or the sigh of wind. People no longer gathered the way they once did. The old dock leaned dangerously, its boards gray and brittle. The laughter of children was gone, replaced with silence and memories that had long since faded. For little Clara, though, the lake wasn't just water. At 3 years old, she didn't remember its glory days. She only knew it as part of her world, as constant as the porch where she played or the rocking chair where her grandfather dozed. And on that damp evening, as the whimpers carried across the wind, Clara's small heart beat faster than her tiny feet could carry her. She turned from the shore and ran, stumbling in the wet grass, back toward the farmhouse. Her curls clung to her damp cheeks as she burst onto the porch. She tugged fiercely at her grandfather's sleeve, eyes wide with urgency, pointing back toward the lake. At first he chuckled, thinking she had spotted another duck or perhaps one of the turtles that sometimes wandered up the banks. But when he saw the desperation in her face, the unblinking insistence in her little blue eyes, his smile faded. "All right, sweet pea," he murmured, pushing himself up from the chair. His knees ached from years of labor, his shoulders bent from hauling nets in another lifetime. Once, he had been one of the best fishermen on the lake, respected by every man in town. Now he was the town's elder, retired, slower, but still sharp when it came to the water. "Show me." The child grabbed his hand with surprising strength and half-dragged him toward the shore. The evening light had dimmed further, thunder rumbling in the hills. As they reached the lake's edge, the scene unfolded with heartbreaking clarity. There, thrashing desperately in the shallows, was the shepherd. His body was bound in cruel tangles of fishing nets, nylon biting into his fur. Every time he tried to pull free, the ropes only tightened. Water splashed high as he fought for air, his chest heaving with exhaustion. The once proud animal was a shadow of his true self, mud-streaked, ribs faintly visible, his paws raw from struggle. His cries pierced the night, fragile and aching. The old man's eyes widened, his weathered face etched with disbelief. "Good Lord," he whispered, clutching his cap in one hand. "Those nets. I left them years ago when the dock collapsed. I thought they sank long ago." No one knew. His voice trailed off, heavy with guilt. A fisherman leaves nets behind, and years later, this, an innocent creature, trapped, punished for his neglect. He felt the weight settle in his chest like an anchor. Clara didn't see the guilt, only the suffering. She let go of her grandfather's hand and stumbled toward the water's edge, her boots sinking into the mud. "Careful," he called, his voice trembling, but she didn't stop. Her eyes never left the shepherd, whose movements grew weaker by the second. The cries must have carried, for within minutes shadows began to emerge from nearby homes. Lanterns flickered as neighbors arrived, whispers chasing one another like the wind. "What's happening? Is that a dog? Who could leave him like that?" Mothers clutched their children, men stepped forward uncertainly. Some muttered about danger, about rabies, about the risk of helping. Others simply stared, shaken by the sight of the toddler standing so close to the drowning shepherd, her tears mixing with the rain. "Get back, Clara," her grandfather urged, fear edging his voice. But she didn't move. Instead, she bent down on her tiny knees at the water's lip. The shepherd's frantic eyes found hers. His breathing was shallow, chest rising unevenly, but the wild panic in his gaze slowed when he saw the little girl. Something shifted in that instant. The trembling animal, moments from giving up, stilled. Clara reached out her small hand, fingers brushing against the wet ropes near his muzzle. Her touch was feather-light, innocent, without fear or hesitation. The shepherd gave a soft, strangled whimper and then, astonishingly, pressed his nose against her hand. A gasp rose from the crowd behind them. "Did you see that?" He calmed down. "Lord have mercy." The old man felt his throat tighten as he watched. That simple gesture, a child's touch on a dying animal's face, had done what no lantern, no rope, no shouting neighbor could achieve. The shepherd was still bound, still drowning in nets, but in that moment he wasn't alone. Clara's grandfather knelt beside her, his voice breaking. "We'll get him out, sweet pea. I promise. We'll get him out." His calloused hand rested gently on her shoulder as the men of the village moved closer, galvanized not by duty, but by the silent bond unfolding before them. And there, on the muddy banks of a quiet lake, under the weight of a gathering storm, the secret was laid bare. An animal long forgotten, a child who refused to turn away, and a community about to be reminded what compassion truly meant. The storm clouds gathered heavier above the lake as the shepherd struggled against the merciless grip of the tangled nets. The shallow water splashed violently each time the animal tried to pull himself free, but exhaustion was already written across his trembling body. The lanterns of the villagers glowed like fireflies in the night, their reflections scattered across the uneasy surface of the water. One by one, neighbors had left their porches and hurried down the dirt path when they heard the faint cries of a baby girl. By now, nearly the whole street had gathered along the shore. But with them came hesitation, doubt, and fear. Some muttered nervously as they watched the dog thrash. "He's dangerous," said a tall fisherman with arms built from years of hauling nets. His voice was stern, as though issuing a warning that should not be ignored. "A drowning animal fights like a demon. He'll bite anyone who touches him. That girl will get herself mauled." A few nodded in agreement, murmuring about rabies, about strays, about the risk of letting something wild so close to their children. A mother clutched her son tighter, whispering that they should drag Clara away before something terrible happened. But the sight before them complicated their fears. Little Clara was still kneeling at the lake's edge, her small hand pressed gently against the shepherd's muzzle. Her blue dress was soaked at the hem, her curls plastered to her cheeks by mist and rain. She was not screaming, not frightened, not recoiling. Instead, she looked at the struggling dog with a sorrow too big for her tiny body, tears sliding down her face and dripping into the water. And when the shepherd felt her hand against his face, his thrashing slowed. His wide, terrified eyes softened just enough for the crowd to notice. The old man, Clara's grandfather, stepped forward then. He was tired from years of work and age, but his voice carried with the weight of respect that decades in the town had earned him. "No creature deserves to die tangled like this," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the murmurs. He kept his eyes on the dog, but his words were meant for everyone. Not after surviving storms and hunger, not after fighting this hard. He doesn't deserve to drown alone. The fisherman shook his head, unwilling to yield. "And what then, Jack? We drag him out and he turns on us? That's a full-grown German shepherd. He could tear a man's arm before you blink. Look at him, ribs showing, eyes wild. You don't know where he's been or what diseases he's carrying." His words carried logic, the practical survival instinct of someone hardened by years of choosing caution over compassion. Others echoed his doubts, muttering that maybe mercy meant ending it quickly, sparing both the animal and themselves. But Clara's little cry shattered their debate. She pressed her face against the shepherd's paw, her tiny shoulders shaking. A sound so small, so fragile, yet more powerful than all their arguments rose above the storm, the broken sob of a toddler refusing to let go of a hopeless creature. It silenced the crowd. Mothers lowered their eyes, ashamed of their earlier words. Men shuffled their boots, the weight of guilt pressing into their spines. Even those most hardened by years of labor could not stand tall against the vision of innocence weeping at the water's edge. Jack placed a hand on his granddaughter's damp hair and looked back at the crowd. His gray eyes shone not with anger but with resolve. "You see her?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "She's not afraid. She's showing us what we've all forgotten. That compassion is worth the risk. That saving a life matters more than protecting our convenience. If this child has the courage to sit here with him, then shame on us if we don't try. There was a long silence. Rain pattered on lantern glass. Thunder rolled in the distance. And then, slowly, one of the younger men stepped forward. He was broad-shouldered, calloused from farm work, but his voice trembled as he spoke. He hasn't hurt her. He could have, but he hasn't. That says something. I'll help. Mrs. Henderson, the baker's wife, followed, folding her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she nodded. She's right. If we let that dog drown while that baby cries over him, we'll never forgive ourselves. The fisherman scowled, still muttering about danger, but his words had lost their strength. Too many had shifted. The tide of the crowd had turned. Jack's voice had given them a reason, and Clara's tears had given them no escape. Then it's settled, Jack said at last, his voice steady. We'll get him out. The villagers stirred into motion. Lanterns were raised higher. Men called for ropes, hooks, knives sharp enough to cut through years-old nylon. Someone ran back for a crowbar. A pair of boys rushed to untie a small rowboat from the dock, their hands eager, their hearts pounding with the thrill of doing something that mattered. Women brought blankets, their voices low with both worry and hope. Jack bent down again, meeting Clara's wide eyes. His face softened. We're going to help him, sweet pea. But you need to stay close to me. Understand? She nodded, her wet lashes clumped together, but she refused to let go of the shepherd's paw. Jack sighed and kissed her forehead. All right then. We'll do it together. The first ropes splashed into the water as the men waded forward. Their boots sank into the mud, but their movements carried purpose now. The fisherman who had argued hardest against the rescue stood with arms folded, muttering about fools throwing themselves into danger, but even he stayed near with a lantern raised, watching. He could not walk away, not after the child's stare had pierced him as much as it had the others. The shepherd, weak and gasping, lifted his head slightly. His eyes darted from face to face, then back to Clara, as though clinging to her presence alone. And when she reached her hand further, brushing his muzzle once more, the animal gave a faint whine that sounded almost like gratitude. The town had decided. Fear had spoken its piece, but compassion had answered louder. As lanterns bobbed and ropes stretched taut, the storm continued to build overhead, the water splashing against boots and planks. What lay ahead would test their strength, their patience, and their unity. But the choice was made. They would not let the shepherd drown. That night, on the shores of a forgotten lake, a divided town took its first step toward something greater, not just rescuing a dog, but rediscovering its own humanity through the smallest hands among them. The storm had begun to thicken, clouds rolling across the lake like heavy gray curtains. The lanterns shook in the restless hands of the townsfolk, their light bouncing over the rippling water where the shepherd still fought to breathe. His chest heaved, the old fishing nets cutting into his soaked fur, dragging him under each time he tried to rise. The men waded forward cautiously, boots sinking into the muck, gripping knives and hooks, their jaws set with grim determination. The women lined the bank behind them, holding lanterns high despite the drizzle, their shawls pulled tight against the wind. It was as though the whole town had been swallowed by this single moment, the fight to free one desperate animal. Jack Harper, Clara's grandfather, led the charge into the lake. His boots filled with water, but he pressed forward, shouting instructions to the younger men. Hold the rope steady. Keep his head above water if you can. His voice carried the grit of someone who had battled storms before, though never like this. Each time the shepherd thrashed, waves slapped against their knees, the slippery nets pulling harder, determined to claim their prisoner. The shepherd let out a broken cry, half bark, half whimper. It cut through the storm like a plea, echoing into the hearts of those watching. Clara, sitting just at the edge of the bank, trembled as she heard it. Her tiny toy boat lay forgotten in the mud. She shuffled forward on her knees, ignoring the arms that tried to hold her back. Her grandfather shouted for her to stay put, but she didn't listen. Instead, she crawled right to the lip of the water, her dress darkened with rain and soil. "Clara," a woman cried, but the child didn't turn. She leaned toward the shepherd, her soft voice barely audible above the wind. "Shoo, it's okay," she whispered. "Don't be scared." The dog, thrashing violently moments before, stilled at the sound. His amber eyes locked on her small frame, and for the first time that night he stopped fighting. His chest still heaved, but his struggles slowed, as if her presence alone anchored him. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Even Jack froze, knife in hand, as the beast that had been fighting the nets with raw panic only seconds earlier pressed its muzzle forward through the strands. Clara reached out her tiny fingers, brushing his wet fur. The shepherd, bleeding, exhausted, terrified, found the strength to lick her hand. A stunned silence followed, broken only by the storm. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but she smiled through them, her little palm resting on his nose as though she could carry his pain. That single gesture ignited the men around her. Jack's voice rang out again, firmer this time. "Cut faster. He's trusting us now. Don't waste it." Knives flashed in the lantern light as the men slashed at the thick, knotted cords. One strand snapped, then another, releasing pressure from the shepherd's chest. But each cut seemed to anger the nets, sending more threads tightening around his limbs. The men grunted, pulling against the water, one nearly slipping under before another grabbed his arm. The storm gave no mercy. Thunder rolled and rain pelted harder, mixing with sweat on their brows. "Keep his head above," Jack bellowed, his old hands gripping a rope with surprising strength. "Don't let him sink." Two men held the shepherd's body steady while another worked a hook beneath the stubborn knots, pulling the nylon free from his bleeding paw. Each second felt like hours. The crowd on shore cried out whenever the dog slipped lower, lanterns shaking as if their light alone could hold him afloat. Through it all, Clara remained at the edge, whispering to him, her little fingers stroking through the gaps in the rope. "It's okay," she murmured. "They'll help you. Don't give up." The shepherd's gaze never left hers. Even in pain, even half-drowned, he responded not with fear but with trust. Every time her hand touched him, his thrashing eased, as though her presence told him the fight was worth it. Finally, with a final heave, the last of the nets loosened. A cheer erupted from the bank, but it was short-lived. The shepherd, freed at last, went limp. His heavy body collapsed into the arms of the men, half-conscious, too weak to stand. They hauled him toward the shore, grunting with the effort, his sodden fur weighing them down. "Bring him here," Jack shouted, guiding them to a flat stretch of ground near the lanterns. The men laid the dog carefully in the mud, his chest rising faintly, eyes fluttering. Clara scrambled forward, ignoring the hands trying to pull her back, and pressed her small palm against his side. "Wake up," she pleaded softly, her voice breaking. "Please don't leave." For a moment, nothing happened. The storm howled above them, and despair threatened to smother the relief of freedom. But then, the shepherd let out a weak groan, his paw twitching against Clara's knee. She gasped, then clapped her hands together, tears still streaming. And in that instant, a sound not heard in weeks filled the night air, Clara's giggle. A fragile, broken little laugh, but laughter nonetheless. It rang out across the lakeside, sweeter than any hymn, stronger than any thunder. Jack froze, his eyes stinging with tears. It had been so long since his granddaughter had laughed, not since her mother's passing. And now, here she was, soaked, muddy, crying and laughing all at once, because a dying dog had chosen to live. He placed a trembling hand over his mouth, whispering to himself, "She's healing." The villagers leaned closer, hope stirring in their hearts as they watched the child and the shepherd together. The dog's head rested weakly on Clara's lap, his eyes barely open, but his breathing steadier now that the cruel nets were gone. "Get him to the barn," Jack ordered, his voice firm again. "We've got straw, blankets, salve. He won't survive out here." Without hesitation, the men lifted the shepherd onto a makeshift stretcher of rope and planks. Women wrapped blankets around him, shielding his shivering body from the rain. Clara walked beside them, her tiny hand resting on his paw even as they carried him. The town, once divided by fear, now moved as one, lanterns lighting the way through the storm, hearts bound by a fragile thread of hope carried by a child's compassion. And as they left the lake behind, the abandoned nets sinking into the water, the storm seemed to lose some of its fury. Perhaps it was coincidence, or perhaps the heavens themselves had softened at the sight of a toddler's innocence pulling an entire town toward mercy. The barn was warmer than the storm outside, but the air inside felt heavy with uncertainty. The German shepherd lay stretched across a bed of straw, his breaths shallow, his body trembling with exhaustion. The villagers, still damp from the rain, gathered in a hesitant circle, their lanterns flickering against the wooden beams. Jack knelt close, one hand steadying his granddaughter Clara, who had refused to leave the dog's side since the rescue. Her small fingers remained tangled gently in his fur, as if holding him to life itself. Dr. Miller, the town's aging veterinarian, arrived in a hurry, carrying his leather bag and wiping rainwater from his spectacles. He crouched beside the shepherd and ran practiced hands along the dog's ribs. His expression darkened. "These aren't just from tonight," he muttered. He gently parted the fur to reveal long, faded scars crisscrossing the animal's flanks. "These go back years. Deep cuts. Rope burns. This dog has been beaten, finty, starved." His voice dropped lower, thick with disgust. "Someone did this to him." The barn filled with uneasy murmurs. The sight of the wounds silenced even those who had doubted the rescue. No one could look at the shepherd's battered body and still call him dangerous. He wasn't wild. He was broken by human hands. From the corner of the barn, an old neighbor stepped forward. Mr. Collins, stooped with age but sharp-eyed, leaned on his cane as he peered closer at the animal. He squinted, then gasped softly. "I know him," he whispered. The villagers turned. "That's Fisher's dog. The one that lived by this very lake years ago." A ripple of recognition stirred through the crowd. Some nodded slowly, remembering faded stories. Others looked confused. Mr. Collins steadied his voice. "He belonged to Thomas Fisher. Good man. Loved the water. He had 2 children, little boys. That shepherd was their shadow. Followed those boys everywhere. Guarded them by the lake shore, slept by their beds at night. The whole town knew that dog. Loyal as the day is long." But the Fisher family, another villager spoke hesitantly. The old man lowered his gaze. "They were lost. One winter's night, the boat capsized in a storm. Thomas and his boys never came home. His wife moved away in grief. No one saw the shepherd after that. We all thought he was gone too." He shook his head. "Looks like he didn't die. He just disappeared." The revelation settled heavily in the barn. Faces turned back toward the shepherd with new sorrow, as though his scars had deepened before their eyes. This was no stray. He was a ghost of their own past, carrying wounds that told of survival after tragedy. The nets that nearly drowned him were not just a trap in the lake. They were the weight of years, the broken remains of a life once filled with loyalty and family. Clara did not understand every word, but she felt the meaning. The sadness in the adults' voices, the silence that followed, all of it pressed against her tiny heart. She leaned down and whispered into the shepherd's ear, words too soft for the others to hear. Her lips brushed against the torn fur, her breath warm against his face. His eyelids fluttered, and though his body trembled, he let out a low groan, not of fear, but of recognition. It was as if her voice told him he was no longer alone. The symbolism was not lost on Jack. Standing over them, he thought of those broken nets, now lying somewhere at the bottom of the lake. Twisted ropes that once held the shepherd under were nothing compared to the invisible chains of his past. Broken nets, Jack whispered under his breath, his eyes glistening. Broken trust. And still he fought to live. Dr. Miller tried coaxing the shepherd with a tin bowl of water, but the dog turned his head away, too weary, too cautious. Someone offered scraps of meat, but again the shepherd refused, his ribs heaving with effort as though he had no strength left for hope. The crowd shifted nervously. If he wouldn't drink, if he wouldn't eat, he might not survive the night. But then Clara moved. Without a word, she lifted the small cup from the vet's hand. Her tiny fingers clutched the rim with determination. She knelt lower, bringing the water to the shepherd's lips. "Please," she said softly, her first words spoken since the rescue. The crowd hushed. The shepherd's ears twitched. His nose brushed the cup hesitantly, his eyes flicking to hers. Something passed between them, a fragile thread of trust too delicate for anyone else to hold. Slowly, trembling, his tongue touched the water. He drank just a sip at first, then another. Relief spread like wildfire in the barn, sighs escaping lips, tears slipping quietly down faces. Clara smiled through her damp curls. She set the cup down and gently offered a piece of bread in her hand. The shepherd hesitated only a moment before taking it, his teeth grazing her fingers so carefully it seemed as though he feared hurting her. The bread disappeared, and for the first time, color flickered faintly in his weary eyes. Jack felt his throat tighten. He had watched his granddaughter sink into silence for weeks after losing her mother, her laughter gone, her words stolen by grief too big for her small heart. And now, here she was, speaking, smiling, giving hope not only to the shepherd but to herself. She was healing him, and he was healing her. The townsfolk saw it too. Whispers turned into nods, and nods into soft words of comfort. They no longer looked at the shepherd with suspicion but with awe. For the scars that marked his body were the same scars etched into their community, reminders of tragedy, of loss, of pain carried silently through the years. And in Clara's simple act, those scars seemed to begin their slow journey toward mending. The dog lowered his head back into the straw, his body trembling less now, his breath steadier. Clara curled beside him, her small hand resting protectively on his chest as though she were the guardian instead of him. The lantern light cast them both in a golden glow, two broken souls finding solace in one another. And around them, the town stood silent, humbled, united, and deeply moved. They understood, perhaps for the first time in years, that compassion could breathe life into even the deepest wounds. The first morning after the storm broke soft and golden over the lake. Sunlight spilled across the rippling water, glinting on the waves that had once hidden nets of despair. In the barn, the German shepherd stirred, stretching his battered body as if testing whether life had truly returned to him. His eyes blinked open slowly, scanning the familiar faces that hovered close. But most of all, they rested on the toddler curled up beside him. Clara had fallen asleep with her tiny hand resting on his chest, her damp curls pressed against his fur as though she had been standing guard through the night. When Jack opened the barn door, letting in the scent of wet earth and pine, he froze. There she was, his granddaughter, smiling in her sleep, her lips curved in a peace he hadn't seen in months. The dog gave a faint wag of his tail, a small, grateful gesture, before lowering his head back to the straw. Jack's heart tightened. The shepherd wasn't just surviving, he was already living for her. By the week's end, the town marveled at how quickly the animal regained strength. His steps were slow at first, his ribs still showing through the thin coat, but wherever Clara went, he followed. Along the lakeshore, she toddled with her toy boat, dragging it through the sand, and the shepherd limped faithfully behind her, ears pricked, eyes alert. On the porch in the evenings, while the grown-ups spoke in hushed tones, he lay at her feet, his muzzle resting gently on her toes as though to claim her as his charge. And when night fell, Jack often found Clara asleep with her blanket spread half over her and half over the shepherd, as if she could not dream safely without knowing he was warm beside her. It was in these small acts, the blanket, the toys she shared with him, the way she patted his scarred fur without flinching, that the townsfolk began to witness something remarkable. Clara, who had lived in silence since her mother's passing, began to laugh again. At first it was a small giggle, startled out of her when the shepherd tried to chase his tail clumsily in the yard. Then, a fuller sound rolling like music through the farmhouse, when he pawed at her toy boat and pushed it across the floor with his nose. Each laugh felt like a miracle, filling the home with light that had been absent for too long. Jack often stepped aside when it happened, leaning against the doorway with tears he didn't bother to hide. His neighbors noticed too. One evening, Mrs. Hill from down the lane arrived carrying a basket of bread and blankets. "For the dog," she explained softly, though her eyes lingered on Clara's laughter. Soon after, others followed, old coats stitched into makeshift bedding, medicine jars, tins of meat, even fresh fish from the lake. The barn filled with tokens of care, not only for the shepherd but for the little girl whose smile had returned because of him. The town, once divided over whether to let the dog live, now found themselves united in his survival. They watched the bond between child and animal deepen day by day, and in that bond, they rediscovered something they had almost forgotten. Compassion could heal even the deepest scars. Children from nearby houses came to see the miracle dog, whispering in awe as he padded slowly behind Clara. He never barked, never growled. He only stood tall at her side, his eyes following her every move, his scarred body seeming less a mark of weakness and more a badge of loyalty. By the lakeside, villagers began to say his silhouette beside her was like a guardian angel watching over the water. Soon enough, a name began to spread among them, the guardian of the lake. The title traveled beyond their village. Traders who came for fish carried the tale to nearby towns. They spoke of a toddler who had rescued a shepherd from the nets of death, and of how the dog had, in turn, rescued her from silence and grief. In church pews, farmers' markets, and fishing docks, the story was told and retold. Some wept when they heard it. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Yet all agreed on one thing. It was proof that innocence and loyalty could bring light where only shadows remained. For Clara, none of that mattered. She was too young to understand her fame or the whispers spreading beyond her town. What she understood was simple. Her new friend slept beside her, ate from her tiny hand, and walked wherever her little feet led. The shepherd was no longer just an animal rescued from the lake. He had become her shadow, her comfort, her guardian. On one particularly bright afternoon, Jack watched from the porch as Clara toddled down to the lakeshore, the shepherd limping but determined at her side. She plopped into the sand, her toy boat bobbing in the shallow water. The dog stood behind her, his chest rising strong and steady, his eyes scanning the horizon. Jack felt a lump rise in his throat. For the first time since tragedy had struck his family, he believed in tomorrow. At supper that night, as Clara's laughter rang through the kitchen and the shepherd dozed at her feet, Jack raised his eyes to the ceiling and whispered a prayer of thanks. "She's smiling again," he murmured. "Thank you for sending him." And outside, as lanterns flickered across the town, The story of a broken dog and a grieving child bound together by compassion grew into legend. The guardian of the lake had been born, not from strength or power, but from the tender hand of a toddler who refused to let him drown. Summer had barely settled over the lakeside town when the trouble returned. The shepherd, once little more than skin and scars, had grown stronger in the weeks since his rescue. He still limped from old wounds, but his coat glistened, and his ribs no longer showed so sharply. He followed Clara everywhere, from the porch to the water's edge, his presence a constant reminder that some bonds are written deeper than law. Yet peace is fragile, and theirs was about to be tested. It began on a late afternoon when a stranger appeared on the dirt road leading into town. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with weathered skin and eyes that spoke of years spent at sea. A fisherman's son returned after decades away. His name was Daniel Fisher, nephew of Thomas Fisher, whose family had been lost on the lake so many years before. Word spread quickly. Some welcomed him as blood of the old fishing line. Others watched warily, sensing his stern demeanor. Daniel's gaze fell almost immediately on the shepherd lying near Clara at the lakeside. His eyes narrowed. "That's my uncle's dog," he said firmly, stepping closer. "By rights, he belongs to me." The word struck the crowd like thunder. Jack, who had been mending nets on the porch, stood slowly, his weathered hands curling into fists. "Belongs?" he repeated coldly. "That dog nearly drowned in forgotten nets. He's found a home here with my granddaughter." Daniel's voice grew sharper. "Bloodline matters. He's Fisher's dog, and Fisher blood runs in me. You can't change history. The dog is mine." The shepherd stirred uneasily, sensing the rising tension. Clara, confused but instinctively afraid, threw her arms around his neck, pressing her cheek to his scarred fur. Her lip trembled, and when Daniel stepped forward again, she began to cry. The sight melted even the hardest faces in the crowd, but Daniel didn't waver. "I have claim. Law would see it the same way," he insisted. The town was thrown back into division. Neighbors who had wept during the rescue now argued in whispers about fairness. Some muttered that perhaps Daniel was right. If the dog had belonged to the Fisher family, perhaps he had legal right. Others bristled at the thought of tearing the animal from Clara's arms, their hearts reminding them of the bond they'd witnessed. Jack's voice cut through the murmurs. "No piece of paper, no bloodline, can match what we've all seen. That dog chose this child. He fought to live for her. And she has healed because of him. You'd rip that away?" But Daniel would not be moved. "Feelings don't trump law," he said, his jaw tight. "If it comes to it, I'll take this matter before the county judge." By evening, the dispute had grown so fierce that the villagers called for a formal gathering at the lakeside hall, a place where generations had once made decisions for the town. Lanterns burned bright against the wooden walls as the townsfolk packed inside, the storm of voices rising with each passing moment. Clara clung to the shepherd's fur in the front row, her sobs soft but steady, while Jack stood protectively behind her. The arguments flew like sparks. "He belongs with blood kin," shouted one man, pounding his fist against the bench. "He belongs where he's loved," answered Mrs. Hill, her voice trembling with conviction. "Law has to mean something," Daniel snapped, standing tall in the center of the hall. "Without it, we're no better than chaos." "And what about mercy?" Jack countered. "What about loyalty? Does the law measure the tears of a child? Does it count the nights she slept without laughter until this dog returned it to her?" The room fell silent for a moment, the echoes of his words clinging to the rafters. Then Clara, too young to form speeches, made her own plea. She buried her face in the shepherd's fur and sobbed so hard the dog himself stirred. Slowly, painfully, he rose to his feet. The limp in his step was heavy, yet he forced his way forward, ignoring the murmurs around him. Step by step, he moved until he stood before Clara. Then, with deliberate grace, he lifted his scarred paw and placed it gently in her lap. The hall gasped. It was no bark, no growl, no words at all, and yet it spoke louder than any argument. Loyalty made flesh, a vow that no law could sever. Clara's tears slowed, replaced by a small, trembling smile as she clutched his paw in both her tiny hands. The dog leaned his weight against her knees, his eyes clear and unafraid, as if daring anyone to take him away. Jack's voice broke the silence. "You see? He's made his choice. Not with words, but with his life." One by one, villagers began to nod. A hand rose, then another, then dozens. It became a vote, not bound by courtrooms or signatures but by hearts. When the tally was counted, the result was overwhelming. The shepherd would stay with Clara and Jack. Daniel's face darkened, his pride wounded by the crowd's decision. For a moment, it seemed he might press the matter further, but when he looked at Clara, her small arms wrapped around the shepherd, her eyes fierce with love, even he faltered. His shoulders dropped, and though bitterness lingered in his gaze, he turned away. "So be it," he muttered. "But don't think this ends here." With that, he stormed out into the night. The hall exhaled as one. Clara's giggle, light and sudden, filled the silence. She hugged the shepherd tightly, whispering words only he could hear. Jack knelt beside them both, his eyes glistening with tears he did not wipe away. The townsfolk left the hall with heavier respect in their hearts. They had seen not only a community divide and heal, but also a declaration of loyalty so pure it could not be ignored. From that night on, no one questioned where the shepherd belonged. He was not Fisher's dog, not just a survivor of the lake. He was Clara's guardian, and through her he had become the beating heart of the town itself. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the loudest truths. On that stormy evening, it wasn't the strength of grown men or the wisdom of elders that saved a life. It was the cry of a toddler, a little girl whose innocence refused to let suffering be ignored. Clara's tears reached where reason could not, softening hearts hardened by fear, and reminding an entire town that compassion is stronger than law, stronger than doubt, and stronger than despair. The German shepherd, once broken and bound by cruel nets, became more than just a survivor. He became a symbol. To the townsfolk, he was proof that loyalty can outlast scars. To Jack, he was a second chance at hope. And to Clara, he was family, her guardian of the lake, her silent protector, her friend. In his eyes reflected the promise that no past cruelty could erase the bond of trust he had chosen. From that day on, the lakeside town was never the same. Where once fear had divided them, now unity grew. Neighbors carried pride in the story of the little girl and her dog, retelling it by lamplight and fireside, their voices trembling with emotion. Strangers traveled to see the bond themselves, standing quietly at the water's edge where a child's compassion had changed everything. The town wept once for tragedy, but now it wept for joy, tears not of loss, but of healing. And so, if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes loyalty never fades. Like, comment, and tell us where you're watching from, because sometimes the purest miracles begin with the gentlest hands.